briefly, so the reason that Dale asked me to speak to this is that in my career I've worked first in the private sector but then in the public sector, and so often this sort of work is thought about primarily as a private sector thing, brand. We don't think necessarily about brand within the public sector or the third sector quite so much. And so I just want to tell a couple of stories about my experience of connecting some of these things. But I actually wanted to go back. It was interesting you started with university, because that's kind of when I was looking back at this, I thought, oh my God. I mean, I'm one of the oldest here. I was at university a very long time ago, and how I first came across this was just shortly after graduation. I was doing some work for the Ford Motor Company. And as many of you may know, they have this up on their board room, Culture Eats Strategy for Breakfast. And I got really curious about that because my experience of starting work was I'd done an international business degree, and then my first job was in Nigeria. And everything I had learned on a 4-year international business degree did not equip me at all to do work as a sales and marketing manager in Nigeria. And I got really curious about these things, and then learned about them later in my career in terms of you can have, and this is the Ford thing for me, you can have the best strategy in the world, if you can't deliver it, so what? It's only worth the paper it's written on. But that was a theoretical concept. It wasn't something that I really understood in practice until I got out into the workplace and started actually experiencing roles where I was in charge of strategy, and we would put a huge amount of effort and energy into being really clear about where we were going, what the customers were telling us, all of that. And then we'd come around a year later and go, oh bugger, you know, all those great things that we said we were going to do, we've done about 10% of them. What's actually happened there? Why have we failed to deliver on the promises that we made, even if we were smart and looked at what the customers told us we wanted? So I got curious in sort of preparing for this, and the 2 examples I want to tell you about, you know, the connections between this and what actually happens. And it reminded me of this work and these so-called moments of truth, which is, you know, we say one thing. So some of you were talking about some of the brands, Jeep, Chanel, whatever. And so there is a brand promise that's out there, but how much when we then encounter that brand as consumers, or in the case I'm going to talk to you about as citizens, does our experience actually tally with what is put out there? And that's when we get the mismatch between our expectations and our disappointment, or our joy, depending on what they are. So I'm going to just talk to you about a few examples of these moments of truth. And any of you who have you know, had some expectations about brand and then been let down, you kind of know what I'm going to be talking about here. And thinking about the examples I'm going to share with you are the organisations I've worked in and with, about how do you get the people lining up behind that. So the disconnect between what you say and what you actually do is as small as it possibly can be. And so it's not new. So this was a case study I learned at university. So the whole issue about moments of truth was first looked at by this gentleman who ran SAS and did an amazing turnaround. So you'll see some of the stats there. They were losing 17 million a year when he took over in 1991. By 1982, he managed to turn that round to a profit, and by 1984, they were Airline of the Year. Okay, and so the question was, you know, why and how did that turnaround happen, and then how did we use some of these insights in some of the examples I'm going to talk to you about? And what Jan got really focused on was really being clear to the point that Dale was making earlier about what is the promise that we are implicitly and explicitly making, and how do our customers experience that? And Virgin, which is another one that Dale's just talked about, have taken this very literally into the work that they're doing. Natasha, who's head of talent and brand at Virgin East Coast, because one of the challenges, if you think you get on an aeroplane, your experience of that brand is the staff that serve you your drinks, that do the safety briefings, etc., etc. And any of you who haven't worked in the airline sector may not know, but those teams come together on a very ad hoc basis. So I might be flying this particular route, and I might, every time I get on a plane, may have a completely different group of individuals to work with than I had on the last flight that I was on. So all of our traditional mechanisms about how do we, get employee engagement, how do we make sure that the team leader is connecting with the teams, go completely out of the window when you're looking in an airline, because you haven't got that continuity of management. And so what you have to seek is what's the higher purpose? So what's the higher purpose that you can come together around, that you can have alignment to, that people can get connected to, which means it doesn't matter if it's kind of the 5 of us on a plane today and then it's the 5 of us on a plane tomorrow. We're all really clear about what's the personality and what are the attributes and how we need to show up. And the work Natasha's been doing recently in Virgin East Coast is since they won the franchise, because they've had the West Coast for quite a while and they've only recently run the East Coast franchise, is thinking about the same thing happens with train crews. So if you're on the train crew, it's a different crew every time. The shift pattern, in order to run the sorts of shifts that they need to run, you're not going to be able to have those connections with teams. And so thinking about, as the example you were showing, what is the core, what's the personality of their brand, and then how do they recruit and how do they develop people to live that brand. But it goes back to some of the case studies that Leanne was doing. So I just thought, for those of you who think this might be a new thing, it's much longer and much older than, because when I thought, well, I'll just have a look and see what Google, as we all do nowadays, says about this. And it claimed that it was the chairman of P&G who invented this in 2005. And I thought, no, they obviously haven't gone far enough back in their research. So Jan's memoir. So just to share an example, and again, this is one, any of you who've been travelling and have had the joy of going on the Underground, and those of you who tried to get here by the Central Line today will have a view on how effective that is. What do you notice? All I've just popped up there are the 3 logos. So this is the Hong Kong Underground, New York, and Transport for London. So based in their choice of logos, what do you notice about anything?
It's a stop sign.
There's a stop sign. Yeah. So subliminally, that already gives you a different message. Anything else you notice?
The New York doesn't have a motto.
The New York one
doesn't have a motto underneath.
On this one?
Yeah.
The 2 are very emotive and one doesn't have anything.
So what's the emotive ones for you?
Well, the most emotive one is the Caring for Life's journey.
Mm-hmm.
That's really ramping it up. Train journey.
Yeah. What do you think the Hong Kong Underground are trying to say with just even their logo?
We do everything for you.
We care, and what do we care about? You, yeah? And it was interesting how they came about to completely rethink. So for many, many years, they were doing benchmarking. Most good companies do benchmarking. Now, if you are the now they were built probably sort of 40 years ago, the core thing. So they're much younger than the other 2. But if you imagine you're benchmarking yourself against, they used to benchmark themselves against London, New York, and Paris. Now, if you continually benchmarked yourself against those, where do you think, even if you've never travelled on any of these, where do you think you would come if you're the new upstart? At the bottom? You've got the most modern.
Oh, sorry, at the top.
At the top, yeah. And so the problem is, if you only compare yourself with the incumbents in your sector, yeah. So what's our purpose? We're an underground, yeah. We're an underground railway. So where are the other underground railways? Well, they're in Hong Kong. And what they realised was that actually they had to rethink what their promise was, because every time they were coming first, so every time they went out and benchmarked, they were head and shoulders above all the other undergrounds all around the world. Their customer satisfaction was shocking. Their employee engagement was through the floor, and they're going, hang on a minute, we don't understand, what are we doing wrong? You know, because we're the best in the world, but actually we're, you know, simultaneously crap. So there's something going wrong here. So what they got really curious about is, what are we actually in the business of? What is our promise? And the primary connection that anybody arriving into this, and this predated Britain handing back Hong Kong, when you arrived in Hong Kong, your first experience of Hong Kong was getting off the plane and getting on this line to get into the city. Yeah? Now, any of you have arrived in a country for the first time, and then you need to go and purchase a ticket to get on this train that's going to take you into the city. What do you need to purchase that ticket? Money, but what sort of money do you need specifically? Change, yes. And what have you not got if you've bought your Hong Kong dollars back in your airport? You've got no change. So what you were getting was you get hundreds of thousands of people every year getting off a plane, going to the terminus and going, right, I need a ticket. First thing, I can't actually buy a ticket because I've got no change, and now I've got to stand in this horrendous queue, etc., etc. So what they started to think about is, hang on, what we're about is conveying people as smoothly, effectively, and efficiently as possible from A to B. Yeah, and if they're arriving exhausted and tired from a flight, actually they want looking after. They want this to be easy. They don't want this to be yet another stressful experience for them. So hence the reframing of what is our purpose, why are we here, what are we delivering around journeys, because actually many people coming in and out are on holiday or visiting people, or even if you're on business. And so who else might they benchmark themselves against? If you reconfigure yourself that your role is about having people have journeys that are enjoyable and where they feel taken care of. So you might then look at how airlines do it, yeah? Who else might you benchmark yourself against? Hospitality, yeah. So just the best in class, so particularly if I'm flying in and then I'm going to be travelling and I'm staying at one of their better hotels, what's the experience of being greeted by, etc. Hence that. So it's exactly the same product, but very different promises. Yeah, and therefore, when you then look at how did they go about recruiting their staff, developing their staff, and thinking about even the job design of, do we have, and this is, I know, quite emotive here in London, do we have staff on platforms? Do we have staff selling tickets? Do we have any human being within who's remotely helpful anywhere within the station? And they have completely redesigned their organisation through the lens of what's our brand promise and what do we experience and how does that map back to how we actually show up in practice. So just thought that might be an interesting one, just following on from the sort of the travel example and SAS, but it was that thinking about putting the customer in this place first and saying what's the promise that we're delivering there. So one of the issues that I'm going to show is how do we then therefore create value in organisations? Yeah? And this followed on from my experience of we had a strategy and then we failed to implement it. So I got really curious about if we wanted a change of experience at the front line, whatever your front line might be, and you'll all be in different businesses, yeah? What's the linkage? So often businesses, where's the strategy sitting? It's often here. The executive team go away, possibly paying consultants lots of money, and come up with a strategy. And then these folks over here are actually dealing with the customers every day. And the question really was, well, so what's happening through all of these connections, which means that the promise and the personality that is embedded in the strategy up here actually shows up at the front line. And I want to just share a couple of examples of where we did that. And when Dale and I were talking about this, I said I'm going to start with the public sector, because often people don't think about the public sector as having brands or having any sort of promise or personality. So I'm just going to check how many of you are actually citizens that have to interact with this particular part of government, and we'll see if you're typical of an audience. So how many of you have somebody in your family who is in receipt of a state pension? Yep, a few of you. How many of you have friends or family who have ever been out of work? Yep. And how many of you have ever had to, or know people, or in your family or who have got divorced or separated and have children? Okay, more of you. Well, that's an interesting sign of the times. So that means all of either you or your friends will have interacted with this particular department in all probability. So this is the Department for Work and Pensions. 22 million of us interact with this department every year. So that's 22 million moments of truth if we only touch them once. Most of us have to deal with them so you've got job centre, you've got disability and carers, you've got the pensions, and you've got what's now the child maintenance service. So 22 million of us, and if you're getting paid weekly or monthly, you can do the maths, I'm not very good at maths, that's a lot of moments of truth. And so we got really curious about, there was a lot of work being done at this level in the organisation around, we had three things we had to do simultaneously. We had to save £1.5 billion on a £6 billion budget. We had to increase our citizen engagement scores, the public sector version of customer satisfaction. And we also needed to get rid of over 30,000 staff. So when I started, we had 110,000 staff, and we needed to get it down. It's now down at about 80,000, but at the time we were needing to get it down. Yeah. So that's quite a significant challenge at the same time as also, you know, in terms of being able to do all of those three things together. And so the senior team, we were wrestling with this, and what was the promise, in a sense, that we were making to our citizens, and what was their experience, and how did we even start to begin to make some choices about how we did these difficult things. So for the first time in this country, Canada and New Zealand and Denmark have all done this work within their public sector, but this was the first time this had been done in the UK. We did a large piece of customer insight research to really understand what were citizens' experiences of trying to interact with us. And what do you imagine we found, or what has been your own experience? If you were to give me some words that would describe the brand personality of the Department for Work and Pensions, what sorts of words do you think you might come up with? Oh, everyone did that at once. Sorry, I didn't hear.
Slow.
Slow.
Bureaucratic.
Bureaucratic.
Unreceptive. Unreceptive.
Unreceptive.
Frustrating.
Any more?
Frustrating.
Unhelpful.
Self-involved.
Self-involved.
Depressing.
Depressing. Okay. So in terms of the brand promise then, and I have to say those were quite mild and kind compared to what we actually found. You know, for some people the experience was atrocious. You know, absolutely atrocious, because we had systems. So if you had the misfortune to be the individual who needed to interact with all four of our agencies, you know, you might as well go and live your life in a Kafka novel, because, you know, you actually would never ever come out of this loop, because the systems didn't talk to each other. We worked out that we actually spent £75 million a year on wasted phone calls. So this is phone calls incoming from citizens who wanted genuine queries, and the poor person at the front line, actually we found, so one of the first things we did, we found out they didn't even have the phone number. So say you rang in and you were trying to get to the job centre and you got through to disability and carers, and you said, well, can you just give me the number of the job centre, please? No, I can look it up for you, but then you could go and look it up, yeah? And so because we had never started from the position of the customer and really asked ourselves, if the citizens were to experience what they want to experience, because the other challenge at this point was we were also going digital. So the ministerial intention was that by the time we finished this work, the vast majority of us would interact not with people but through the internet. Yeah, we would go online. And yet, how many of your friends and family who are in receipt of pensions are digitally savvy and would know how to actually interact with a government agency online? So all sorts of different challenges. So what we needed to do was to look at not just so we had all this customer insight, really great piece of work. We were doing lots of work here on the strategy, and the gulf between was massive. How do we actually make this happen in practice? And this was for me the critical thing, is that when we started to work with the frontline staff, we had this massive aha, which was the way in which we were asking our middle managers and our team leaders to manage the frontline staff. The key performance indicators we put in place, the way the jobs were designed, the way the work flowed. Even though the vast majority of our frontline staff, as Dale was saying, their personality, they have joined the civil service because they want to serve. They want to do something in pursuit of public service. They didn't join the service, they didn't want to be in a service where they gave a poor, shockingly bad advice or service. That's not. The DWP processes more payments on a daily basis than our top 5 retail banks. It's vast. Yeah? A lot of people don't realise the sheer scale. Those people who are sitting on the call centres, the people who you're seeing, they don't come to work to do a bad job, the vast majority of them. So we got curious, so what is actually happening, which means that it shows up as difficult, unhelpful, depressing, bureaucratic, yeah? Where's this disconnect between what these people want to do and what's actually happening in practice? And what we realised was that the challenge was in the culture, and it was sort of between the seniors and leaders. And very, very small, tiny things in terms of the point that you were making earlier, Dale, about the truth. Do I feel psychologically safe enough in my workplace to be able to speak the truth, to be able to say, I'm really sorry, to say how I'm feeling about something, or actually, are there a set of KPIs and are there a set of scripts that I have to follow, which means I can't be the human being that I actually am. And that's when we started to realise that in trying to be efficient and in trying to actually take cost out of the business, we've taken the humanity out of the process as well. And so what we needed to do was to go back and look at all levels in terms of how do you experience me as your line manager? Yeah, and how I manage you and how I engage with you and how I give you permission or not will fundamentally impact the way I can interact with in this case, the citizens. And just to give you a small anecdote, which just sort of illustrates this. So I worked in the centre, so I was the equivalent of corporate headquarters. And one of the initiatives we did as part of this was a back to the floor experience. And I arrived out at one of the job centres, somewhere near Guildford, I won't say which one it was, and was immediately ushered into the manager's office to be greeted with the most extraordinarily beautiful tea service. Teapot, cups, saucers, quite unlike anything I'm used to drinking from, and was treated to a very pleasant tea before I was allowed to go out onto the front line and sort of observe the work. By about 10 o'clock I was thirsty again, and I spotted that there was a vending machine that everybody else was using. So I just wandered over and put my 10p in or whatever it was and got the liquid that purported to be tea out from this vending machine. And I was suddenly aware that there was a big kerfuffle going on in the office, and I was thinking, I'm not quite sure what's happening here. And they were like, oh no, you don't need to drink, don't drink, please come back into the manager's office and have a cup of tea. I said, everybody else is getting tea from this machine, so I'm perfectly capable of getting tea from this machine. And they said, yes, but I could see that something was on, something was, they were really uncomfortable about this. And I said, look, I don't, can you just, what's happening? What's going on here? I can see this. They said, well, you're from head office. Yeah, we have vending machines in head office as well. And it turned out that this beautiful tea service was actually the manager's grandmother's. And she'd been so concerned that someone from head office was coming down for the day and that we would somehow find her wanting, or that the office was wanting. She'd gone and seen her grandmother the day before and said, I've got someone from head office coming tomorrow and I don't want them to have tea out of the machine. Can I borrow, a teapot and cups and saucers so she can have a proper cup? Which to me was just so thoughtful and kind and caring and balmy. What it told me more was about how we had behaved as senior leaders, that there was a culture of fear, that actually me coming down on why I was there was I was genuinely curious about what was happening and what we were seeing, so that I could learn from them, because they're the ones interacting with our customers. And yet how they were receiving the visit was as something to be frightened of. Yeah? And once we'd kind of got that, in a sense, the disconnect internally between the promise and what was actually experienced by staff, then we could start to look at what was the shift that was needed here, what was the shift that was needed there, in order to create the shift that was needed there. So I'll just finish with a couple of examples in the private sector, and then just sort of the connection between the various parts. So having put into place what we needed to put in place to really think about all of the elements to join that ladder up within the Department for Work and Pensions. I then have worked with a few other organisations and want to give some examples of practical things that we learnt when we were doing that in the WP that we've put into place in other places, or unintended consequences. So performance management. And there's a saying, what gets measured gets done. So one of the core things that Tesco had recognised a few years ago was that, again, the heart had gone out of its interaction with its customer, and two of its core values that it was trying to major on were empathy and collaboration. And how would empathy and collaboration show up? What matters to customers, what matters to communities, and what matters to colleagues. But one of the most critical, any of you work in retail, and particularly food retail, will know this, one of the critical things that you have to manage is waste, or shrink, which is the difference between what you purchase in from your supplier and what actually ends up going through the till. And it's a significant cost. And it can get lost, in inverted commas, at various places. So it can get lost en route to the store in the supply chain. It can get lost in the warehouse somehow, once it's already arrived at the store. It can get lost once it's been put out on the shelves. And if you think about it, so in that whole chain, there are opportunities for this to get lost or stolen, if we're being truthful about it. Yeah. So there's shoplifting obviously from the shop floor, and then there's a question of is stuff then going missing from the warehouse, which implicates staff, and then is stuff going literally falling off the back of a lorry, which implicates your suppliers. If you, in your performance management system, target your store managers' bonuses on their ability to reduce shrink, what do you think that does culturally? So in order to reduce shrink, what have you got to pay attention to?
Suspicion.
Suspicion, yeah. Who's going to fall under suspicion? Who are you going to be suspicious of? Staff, potentially in the warehouse, customers, yeah, suppliers. So it builds mistrust and suspicion in, because in order for me to be able to reduce my waste, or shrink, I've got to find it, haven't I? And in order to find it, I've got to watch where I'm losing it. Yeah? What do you think that does for empathy and collaboration? It's not rocket science, is it? Yeah? So it's thinking about your people practices, and you might have things that you think have nothing to do with brand, nothing to do with brand promise, nothing to do, but actually the unintended consequences of you putting that particular thing in place for efficiency, for good reasons, you need to run your business. What are the unintended consequences in terms of the behaviour? So that's one example. Talent acquisition, I've already talked about what Natasha's been doing. So Natasha has a branding and marketing background. She's been moved into a talent role, so she's talent and employee engagement. And all of their talent and recruitment process is absolutely aligned to the brand promise. And thinking about, if our brand promise is about being amazing, which is what their strapline is for the East Coast one, how do I build into my recruitment process and find people who will be amazing and show up as that in that? And that means we're recruiting very different types of people than we would historically have done. So First Direct were probably one of the best examples of this. For those of you who are old enough, First Direct started in 1990. They were the first 24/7 telephone bank. If you are a telephone bank, what is the critical capability of the staff that you hire? Language. The ability to be understood on the telephone. What does it not matter about your staff? What you look like, absolutely. And so we ran a recruitment campaign for First Direct, which was entirely over the telephone, which back in 1990 was quite innovative. The first time that we saw the people that we had hired was when they came in to sign their contracts. And a motley bunch they were. But in sense, being blind to appearance, you know, so we had more tattoos than you could shake a stick at. We went way over the top in terms of disability. So we had hired people with all sorts of physical and other disabilities because that didn't matter, that wasn't one of the criteria. And the other thing we'd done, because we'd thought about the job design, this was going to be a 24/7 experience, yeah? So ordinary shifts weren't going to matter. So we needed to think about how do we design these jobs to get maximum coverage. So the minimum shift you could sign on for was 4 hours a week. And so that meant we got a range of people from the population who weren't active in the workforce, but because we were completely flexible about the patterns and whether they did 4 hours from midnight to 4 a.m. or they only did holidays with students, mums, elderly people, and the only criteria, they've got really, really clear about what are the criteria we're going to recruit to, and that's what Natasha's trying to do here as well. So thinking about what's the promise, and then think about all of the different things that you can put in place to drive that. eBay, one of the critical things that Pierre had as in terms of the external brand promise was transparency. That there is a marketplace and buyers and sellers know what is, all the fees are very clear, there's a transparency. And when you look at what they've done in terms of their people practices, again, that transparency was one of the core values. Picking up on the point that Dale was making in terms of trying to drive that through. So my final slide is just to think about when you're thinking about brand personality and promise, and then how you deliver, through your people, is often we start with a series of random people practices, whether it's recruitment or development or pay or performance management, and we don't think about them in the sense of what behaviour, how does that shape the personality of this business, what are the cultures? So what we've learned, both in the public sector and in the private sector, is being really clear about how does the strategic process link you to your customers. So early in my career I worked in the pharmaceutical sector, and we were horribly arrogant and believed that we knew because we were making 15% return year on year and growing like Topsy. And it wasn't until I worked on the HIV portfolio, it wasn't until we brought patients and doctors into the strategic process that it radically changed our approach to the whole therapeutic area. And so for me, how you ensure that the customer voice is part of the strategic process is kind of your starting place. And so many businesses, and I think it's actually got worse since the financial crisis, so I saw a lot more innovation in this space prior to 2008 than I'm seeing at the moment. We seem to have gone back to data rational strategy processes and not making sure that the customer voice is in there. Thinking about, what's our higher purpose? So those brand attributes that Dale was talking about. But then how does that translate into the interface between what's the face of your business that faces off to your customers? How are you designing your organisation as the Hong Kong Railway to really think about how do I make this experience congruent with what I'm saying about our business, our brand. Job design seems to be a dying art. So many organisations I'm in at the moment don't seem to think about the design of their jobs and think about how much freedom, how much compassion, how much all of the attributes that you can design into a job. Think about that in terms of then the experience that the individual has when they're interacting with the. And what I also want to say is a lot of organisations at the moment seem to be very action oriented, so busy doing lots of stuff, but it's not necessarily based on any foresight of what's going on in terms of the customer space and then translating that into, so what does that mean for us? And so for me, this foresight, insight, action when we were in the Department for Work and Pensions was the greatest gift we could have given ourselves. Because if we'd just stuck to our traditional strategic process and we hadn't really gone out and deeply understood what was the customer experience and what therefore, where were we failing, we wouldn't have known which levers to pull. We could have spent a lot of time, a lot of energy, a lot of money doing lots of stuff, but it wouldn't have fundamentally changed the dial in terms of the citizen experience.
Great. Thank you very much.